All right, so let me introduce our guests this evening. First, we have our interviewer, who many of you know, Paul Sparrow. He is a writer, historical consultant, and the former director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Before moving to the FDR Library, he was the deputy director and senior vice president at the museum in Washington, D.C., and he is the author of the upcoming book, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. And then who we know you're really here to hear is Donald L. Miller, who is the John Henry McCracken Professor of History Emeritus at Lafayette College and author of 10 books, including Vicksburg. He has hosted, co-produced, or served as historical consultant for more than 30 television documentaries and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications. So I am going to turn it over to the two of you. Thank you.
I think we get a round of applause for Rebecca and the great work she does here at the Lewis Library and all the programs and everything they do here. Welcome.
Thanks. I want to read that book. I don't know if it's a good book, but it's a great title.
It's a great book. What are you talking about? Well, we'll find out, won't we? Yeah. I just want to start by saying this is a great opportunity for me to talk to such a renowned historian, but also an expert on one of my favorite parts of the war. Some of you may have been here for the Masters of the Air program I did. And I think the one thing that makes this book so remarkable is the intimacy the reader develops with the characters you create. And in dealing with something like the 8th Air Force, where you have tens of thousands of people, how did you pick these guys?
Luck, kind of bumbled into it. I had done 2 books on World War II. Before that, nothing on World War II. First 8 books, all other subjects. Never took a military history course. Wasn't that interested in college or graduate school. Philosophy, intellectual history were my primary concerns. And then I decided, I'll go with Ken Burns. Actually got me excited about doing military history because he does it so broadly: cultural, social history, women, blacks, slavery, the whole war, holistic history. And so I decided I'd take a look at the 8th Air Force, because in doing the story of World War II, my first book on World War II, I was just pulled in very strongly to the 8th Air Force story. And you know how it is when you're looking around for a book title, you look at what's been done. And I noticed that most of them were bullet by bullet descriptions of the air war, as you know. And very few of them dealt with the POW experience. Very few of them dealt with Swiss internment. Very few of them dealt with the home front in England, et cetera. So I thought, I'll try to take this on. And the best way to do this is to start talking to veterans. And I started at Oxford, where I was a fellow at Oxford at All Souls College. And All Souls College is the best kind of college. It has no students. It hasn't had students since 1403.
Professors love that.
So you have no teaching responsibilities. And I could play a lot of tennis, and it's great. So anyway, one day I was walking home to my apartment, and there was an electrician there, and I got in and asked Rose what was going on. They said, they're hooking you up for an electric typewriter. I said, I better get to work. That's a hint. My dad was in the Air Force in World War II, but he wasn't overseas. He was on the home front. But my uncle served in the Air Force in Japan. He flew over Japan on the fire rage with the B-29s. Had another uncle that landed at D-Day with the first wave. So it was in the blood, more or less. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Reading, Pennsylvania. Everybody served. There were Memorial Day parades. And so you were talking to veterans all the time, though you didn't realize, But when I started on the Air Force book, I went down to Savannah. There's an 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah. It's a terrific place. And there was a big conference there, and they were having some veterans speak. And I was particularly interested in Paul Tibbets. I had interviewed Paul Tibbets. Of course, he pilot of the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. not Hiroshima. And so when I went in the door, Paul said to me, we had known each other for years. He said, "You got to go in to that lecture hall. There's a guy speaking now that'll just blow you away. And his name's Rosie Rosenthal." And of course, he became a major character. I heard him speak. I talked to him afterwards, met his family, and began seeing him getting in my car and driving to Upper New York State and spending entire days with him. I was impressed with his record, of course, 52 missions, shot down twice, squadron leader, incredible courage, but no chest thumping, no American triumphalism, just low, muted, kind of, everyday style, and just a hell of a guy. And above all, a person with incredible integrity. And that's kind of how it starts. Rosie would put me in touch with another vet, a member of his crew, and he'd put me in touch with another. And he said, "Now you got to start interviewing POWs." So I would show up at conferences. The 8th Air Force would have its own conferences, and the individual bomb groups would have their conferences. And Steve Ambrose was a colleague of mine at the World War II Museum. Steve founded the museum, and I was on the board down there. And Steve said, "This is how I started. This is how you do it." He gave me a lot of good tips about getting in with the veterans. And I'd simply go to a hotel and put up a card and say, "I'm interviewing people." But I always had somebody, one or two airmen I knew, who would spread the word that this guy's not a jerk. And he's going to know how to ask the right questions, and he's not a sensationalist. So that was it. It was talking to these guys on a regular basis, and then verifying their accounts, and then you dip into the records. Then you go into the Air Force archives, which are enormous, at the Library of Congress, especially at the National Archives in College Park, and in Alabama. And there's a major research center down there that has all the records from World War II. So I had this tremendous abundance of source material, overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. Now the question was trimming it down a little bit, shaping it, and turning it into a story. And I'll stop in a second here. The hardest thing then, as you know, is how to get all the facts right, and without losing the drama, without losing the storyline, without losing the narrative flow of the book, by just stopping in. I'll read a lot of books that I don't particularly care for. They'll pile up a bunch of facts, and then they'll say, now we'll kind of analyze these facts. I wanted to weave through that stuff. I was very influenced by Barbara Tuchman's The Proud Tower and the Guns of August. And she wrote a wonderful book that I have my students read called The Practicing History. And she said, "So how do you get your interpretation in without destroying the story, without boring the reader to death, teaching the reader almost, even if he doesn't want to learn, and you just tell the story, and you tell it really well, you tell it compellingly, and that little analysis, that little interpretation will sneak up behind you on your shoulder and say, here I am, I'm in the book, it's in the story, it's in the story." And that's the hard part of it.
Well, and this book does such a wonderful job of telling this story arc and keeping your characters alive. That's one of the big problems of World War II, is that it's hard to keep a character going through from the beginning to the end, because they would get killed or they would get transferred out, and your characters do go through. I think of this story as 3 acts. They arrive and there's only a handful of them. Then now there's a lot of them, and there are a lot of them being killed, and then the Mustang arrives and they win. But I think the selection of Egan and the other characters that you put around Rosenthal is critical, because really the reason they fight, the reason they go up in the plains day after day knowing they're going to get shot down, isn't because of the folks back home. It's because of the person sitting right next to them, isn't it?
Exactly. You can't have a war without love. The kind of love that men feel to one another as members of crews. And it's a cruel irony, but it's a truth. But you're very sharp to pick that up, because I just sat down one day and just like, how do you begin a book? You know how tough that is. And I just thought of that incident of Egan in London learning about the mission and at Bremen, and calling the base. And there's a diary that I found at the 100th Bomb Group, which is they have a museum in a town called Dis. When you're on the London train going out to East Anglia, you know Dis is here. The conductor will go, "This is Dis," and you get off the train, okay? And so I wander into Dis, and it's just a hamlet, and these are tenant farmers, and they're working like crazy on the control tower, and they're turning it into a museum, and which it is today, and the Nissan huts and things, and they're doing it as volunteers, because their parents were teenagers. They were alive during the war, and they kept diaries, and they remembered a lot of this stuff. So I introduced myself, and they went out. This couple that I stayed with, they invited me into their farmhouse, and every day, they would go out themselves. They say, "You stay here for a little bit. You're going to scare people away. Go out there. They're a stranger. We're going to round up folks whose parents were here during the war, who adopted crews, who know guys, and kept in touch with their families." And they kept bringing people in. I was there for 2 weeks. And I just remember one guy in particular, especially well. He came in with his daughter. His daughter drove him there. They lived in Norwich, which is about 15 miles up the road, Norwich, England. And he was all crippled up with Parkinson's. And he had a pen in his hand, and he wanted to write his name out for me. It took him quite a while to do it. And then his daughter handed me a crumpled letter, about 9 pages, and he could hardly discern, the composition and the cursive. And she said, "This is his letter of homage, not to you. He doesn't know you. This is to the Americans. This is to the boys who came over. We're not going to forget him. We're not going to forget him." And it took him 3 weeks to write that letter. And he wanted to personally, when he found out that you were an American and were writing a book about the 100th Bomb Group, he wanted to bring that letter and have you take it back and give it to some of the boys in the 100th Bomb Group. And that was really impressive. And you do, I mean, the feeling over there about the Americans is very warm. My English publisher changed the title of the book in the English edition from Masters of the Air to 8th Air Force. And I said, "Well, why'd you do that?" And she said, "Well, over here, everybody knows the 8th Air Force, not in the States. You have to put a different title on it."
Well, and the British think the RAF were the masters of the air. So there was a little discrepancy there too. So in the Apple show, they have the 2 little kids that are hanging around the airbase, which I didn't connect directly with the book, although there were a couple of kids. Mm-hmm. How did you feel when you saw them? I thought they really were poignant in this relationships that developed between the locals and the Air Force. Did you think that they captured that was sort of what was going on?
Yeah, it did. It did. When somebody makes somebody as illustrious as the team of Getzman and, Gary was fantastic, Hanks and Spielberg, somebody does that, you're not too keen about criticizing them.
Stephen, I don't think that works.
Yeah. But you do after a while. And there was one scene that captures what you're talking about. And I was sitting around having a beer with an old fella at the museum in the village of Dis. And he said, my parents knew an air crew really well. And I used the word before, adopted the air crew. And they'd wait for their plane to come in. They'd go out to the hard stand in the morning, and they'd give him an extra bag for lunch because they didn't have lunch up there. It's 6 hours to Berlin and 6 hours back. And maybe you have an apple or something like that along the way. But one day his plane didn't come back. They watched all the planes with a big D, square D on it, and they knew his number and it didn't come back. And the sad part of the story was the airman had gotten so close to the family. I should tell you how they met the family. He showed up at their door one day. They didn't know who the hell he was. And he knocked at the door on a Sunday morning and he said, I need a shave. And do you have any hot water? And they could tell he was an airman. He didn't have his goggles on. He looked like a raccoon. And all sunburned here and then white around the eyes. They invited him in. They got some hot water together, and they went in the kitchen, and he stayed in the living room and shaved. And then he peeked into the kitchen and said, I lied. I didn't want to shave. I wanted a family.
And that was so important to them. They were so alone. They were so separated from everything that was familiar and that they cared about. And every day they'd have to get in those planes and take that terrifying ride.
And the woman wound up doing his wash. And then he fell in love with a girl at the tavern. And his father took him down the tavern. And he met a girl there and wanted to marry her when he came back from the war. And when his plane didn't come back, they thought he was gone. But after the war, he showed up back at this to marry the girl. And she had married somebody else. And she named her baby after him.
Oh.
I mean, you run into stories like that. They're priceless. You know, you're almost afraid to write them because people won't believe them. This is Hollywood, you know.
So Don is one of the few people who's had the same book on the New York Times bestseller list in 10 years apart, 2 different decades, right? 3 different decades. So when the book first came out, it got great acclaim. How long did it take? When did the Spielberg Hanks team buy the book, and how long did it take?
It took a while. I mean, I went on to different things. I mean, I wrote a book about New York City in the 1920s. I mean, I wrote a Civil War book, which is on sale here on Grant in Vicksburg, and but I was always in touch with Tom Hanks because he and Spielberg, but especially Hanks, very close to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. They were the initial heads of the fundraising committee for the museum. That's the way to get some money rolling in with them guys heading that. And I had done a film with Tom called He Has Seen War. We took all the veterans that we dealt with in the Pacific and Band of Brothers, and we took them from 1945 when they returned from the war into the 1960s. How did war change them? And how did they see the country changing while they were gone? So I had done that. And the way I hear it, Kurt Sadusky, one of the producers, said they were sitting around one day and Spielberg walked in with this book and he said, this is the next one. He said, I just read it for the second time and we're going to do it. So when Big Chief says we're going to do it, they do it. And so Hanks called me up and I was at the Bethlehem, I live in Pennsylvania, at the Bethlehem Public Library. And I got the call as I was putting my 3 granddaughters in the car and get some ice cream. And I said, just please be quiet for a couple of seconds. This is an important telephone conversation. And the little smart ass says to me, well, we're important too. I said, all right. It worked out all right.
I bet it did.
And then we got going, and after 1,000 interruptions for COVID and all this sort of stuff, it was a hard film to do because Hank said at the beginning, everything in the film has to actually have happened. So we're not going to make anything up. So we're not going to change anybody's name. So you got to follow that story. Like I saw somebody write into the internet and say, well, why the hell did they stop the combat in the sky and go into the Stalag? Well, that's the way it was. We decided on these characters. Go back to your original question. They thought that they were caught by the opening chapter. They loved the idea of Clevin and Egan being best buddies and things like. And they thought, if we can carry this story through the book, and then they saw that I ended with this, they thought, that's the kind of book that we can make into a movie. We have to cut a lot out of this thing because it deals with the whole Air Force. But if we can just do those 100 sections, and there are some things in here that the 100th didn't actually do, but they were done by other groups. Yeah. But nothing that's attributed to Egan or Clevin or Rosenthal.
Well, and I think that that choice of characters that you initially made to help sew the narrative together really works in the film. In the end, I assume you were happy, or did you have notes for Steve?
I was happy. Austin Hoyt, an old friend of mine at WGBH in Boston, he had done a book that I wrote on Chicago called City of the Century. And he said, Don, we're going to try to be faithful to your book. And I was staying at the time with Dave McCullough, an old friend of mine who lives up in that area of the country. And Dave said, they're going to screw with you. He said that they're going to make you mad, and they're going to twist this book all around and change it. And you just got to, hold your water and keep cool, because they're also going to make lots of the sections better. And you're going to go silently, hallelujah. I should have done that myself. So you learn a lot from those people. Tell you one of the biggest lessons you learn as opposed to academic life. Academic life is the pits. Because it's dominated by prima donnas, and there's an awful lot of jealousy involved.
Unlike Hollywood.
Yeah. But Hollywood is different in a sense. They're prima donnas and everything else and competing with one. But when you're on a project, people are arguing all the time, but in a healthy way, because it's a collective enterprise. It's like the war itself. It's collaborative. Film is a collaborative thing. And one guy's going to be working for 2 years on a film, and he's going to get a little credit like that, and not a heck of a lot of money. But he's going to give a whole-souled effort. And there's not a lot of jealousy because everyone has their own responsibilities. So I found that the work atmosphere on the project was very healthy. And usually on movie sets, there's a lot of tension between what's called the talent, the actors. Everybody hates the talent on the project. There's 2,000 people we hired, and I'd say 19,600 of them hated the talent, the 400 talent. But you go beyond the talent, and everybody's keyed into this thing. I mean, we're building B-17s they are in England building B-17s from scratch. Every part of that B-17, except the actual engines, which were electric in the film, they had electric motors inside them. Every button, every bell, every whistle, every whiskey bottle in the barracks, every shoelace on one of the ground. Everything is real and to the period. I was sitting in the studio one day watching the filming of the briefing before Rosenthal tells the group they're going to Normandy that morning. It's his D-Day. And it was very exciting to watch that. But just in front of me was a tray filled with papers, office papers, one of those office trays. And I just picked it up to see what was in there. And they could have put in their ads for tomato juice or something. But they were all official Air Force papers or replicas of such. Everything had to be just right. The jackets, every single jacket was made by hand. And after every set, they would smear the jackets just a little bit of dust and dirt so that this looks like a jacket that has been worn 2 days. And then 2 days later, they spray it to the point where this jacket, 4 days of wear and things. That's how much detail was involved in the production of the thing. So that kind of a spree of everybody contributing and trying to make it right kept things really rolling very well. Because COVID could have killed this thing. I mean, we'd mount a set and take a guy up 70 feet on a crane and put him in a cockpit up there, a fake cockpit, shake him around for 7 hours. And maybe in the sixth hour, the health official would show up and say, close the set. And that's it for the day. And we'll rendezvous in 10 days. So interruptions, a lot like the air war, the constant interruptions. Yeah.
So there are so many battles that cover this arc. I've always been sort of fascinated by Dresden and the fire bombings. But is there one air battle that you think best, we can't go through all of them, that you think sort of best explains what it was really like for these pilots up there as they were flying over?
Well, I think early on, I think it's episode 4, the Munster raid, when they go to the railroad town of Munster, heavily Lutheran city, where the bishop is an anti-fascist, a real opponent of Hitler, and dominated by railroad workers. And up to this point, you're given the idea, the official Air Force mantra is, we're not going to hit civilians. We're not going to aim at civilians. There might be some accidental spillage, but we're not going to aim at civilians, and we're only going to hit military installations. Well, at Munster, that doesn't happen. The aiming point is the center of town and is the cathedral. The hour that mass breaks up and people are coming out, and because we're getting hammered everywhere, and there is a dispute in there. The airmen finally, not to use the word again, they start to air their grievances. This could be women and children killing, and then you go actually on. Everybody decides to fly. They thought they were going to have a mutiny, and the Air Force really worried several times during the war about mutinies when they took thunderous, unbelievable losses, and they fly. And but the commander of the mission said he turned back when they got to the aiming point, to the IP, the initial point where they're going to begin the bomb run, and he wondered if the guys were going to fly with him, if they're going to make the turn. Well, they make the turn, they hit the town, and later on when I talked to Rosenthal about it, he said, well, all I know is they told us that these railroads are the key to the whole industrial economy, and this is a town of railroad workers' housing, and unless we take them out, they're going to be able to ship unfortunate people to concentration camps and POW camps and continue the war with more alacrity. We've got to do it, and it's grim business. I thought there we came close to really talking about the moral divide that the 8th Air Force crosses eventually in a more aggressive way later in the war. Because wars, what makes this so anomalous is wars are generally rougher at the end. I don't know a single war where it's not the worst for the fighting men than at the very end of the war, especially when you're fighting wars for national survival, where if you lose your nation. And then you fight to the end. That's World War II. The Japanese do not surrender. They're not going to surrender. The Germans do not surrender. And then you get into the moral dilemma. I wanted to put in a line at that point, but they pulled it, and were one of the guys is talking to a pacifist and about killing women and children, and the airman said, "Well, we didn't aim that way." And the guy said, "What the hell does that mean if you hit them? What does aiming have to do with it?" He said, "Well, if you mark out like the British did an entire town for slaughter, would you want to be in that town or a town where there's some accidental spillage in a raid on a steel factory?" And that's the difference. And then the airman says, there is a difference between, this pacifist was a German, he says, there is a difference between the Germans and us. If you stopped fighting, we would stop. If we stopped fighting, you wouldn't. That's the difference.
That's a very accurate description. And there's a the moral issue you talk about is particularly clear in a couple of the scenes where you have RAF pilots and American pilots debating the British strategy of, as you said, wholesale bombing of civilian targets, and the American philosophy, at least, of precision bombing. And you said something earlier about a conversation between an RAF pilot and an American pilot about that. Talk a little bit about that tension that was created between the two different philosophies and how it was finally resolved.
Well,
in the big week,
the Americans gave up on pinpoint bombing because pinpoint bombing is an oxymoron. It's impossible to achieve unless you have inordinately accurate spotters on the ground, which we don't have. It's impossible to believe that you could hit targets accurately through cloud cover at 27,000 feet with the Luftwaffe on your, in front of, behind you, and a flak field in front of you. I mean, just imagine and this is what we try to portray in the film. Unlike 12 O'Clock High, which I love that film, but it just deals with base life and with the very important issue of combat fatigue. We wanted to tell a story from inside the cockpit, not like in a movie about jet fighters today where all these things, dogfight after dogfight after dogfight with Tom Cruise, okay? But we wanted to go inside. And I wanted to get away from the image that I had for a while about the Air Force, flying way above the guns in a tight formation in these big brown Boeings and loaded with 12 50 caliber machine guns and being above the fight while my uncle's down there on the ground with the 1st Division in the mud, in the rain, and fighting on the beaches and here and that. And up these guys press buttons and kill people and don't even see the faces of it. Well, as you see in that film, they could see the faces of the German fighters. They were up close, and they certainly saw the faces of the Germans in the POW camps. Yeah, they got a sense of what was going on there, or trying to escape an invasion. We kind of wove that in there too. I don't think there's ever been. All combat is absolutely horrible, but there's never quite been combat like that. You're flying in a plane that's loaded with gasoline. The fuselage is that thick. It's aluminum. It's not steel. 2 of the openings in the side windows for guns are open to the air. There's air blast coming in. It's 65 degrees below zero in an unheated plane. There's no oxygen in the plane. There are no commanders there. There are no generals. There's no patents to tell you what to do. Never in the history of warfare has so much authority been placed in the hands of men that young, whether they got to the target, whether they bombed it or not. The average age of an Air Force crewman was 23 and a half years old, and over 50% of them had never flown in a plane before the war. Then all of a sudden, 52 German fighters descend on you. And unlike infantry combat, you can't say, retreat. No 8th Air Force mission ever turned back. They muscled through the target, whether they got hammered, slaughtered, or not. Bango, straight ahead, right into the fighters, right into the flak field. If the flak was 3 feet in front of you, you couldn't take evasive action. You had to fly with the platform straight, so the bombing is accurate. And then the navigator is in a tough position in the cone of the plane, but imagine the bombardier looking through that sight, and flaks right outside that plexiglass. It's not bulletproof. That plexiglass cone there. And then the bombardier gets hit. And he rushes over and he puts his hand on a sucking wound, and he has to hold it there because the guy's going to die. And then the pilot calls down, "Get your ass up here. Frankie, they just beheaded him with a German shell. He's beheaded, holding on to the steering wheel. They can't get him off the steering wheel. Somebody's screaming in the back that the plane's on fire." All sorts of shit flying around the plane, oxygen masks, individuals. There's nobody's on the seat except the pilot, co-pilot, and the radio man. The chaos inside there. Are you ready for that as a sophomore at Syracuse University? this isn't football practice. And then it's over. I mean, I don't think people in any of the World War II movies I saw portrayed the trauma, the absolute, and even airmen broke down in different ways than infantry guys. We dealt with combat in Band of Brothers and combat fatigue when guys break down. We dealt with it a lot in the Pacific. I did a lot of work on the Pacific and did nothing on the other one. But those guys, it's a steady accretion of the pressure, constant fighting on the line. 48, 50 missions, and you're basically a rag man, and you have to be taken off the line. Air Force guys broke down with boom, trauma, an explosion, plane next to them. Well, the eight guys that play on this guy's softball team are in that plane, and they're all in a fireball, all gone. And you go back to the barracks, and their bunks are stripped, and all their belongings are sent home. So that's trauma. And you go up the next day again, and that's when breakdowns occurred. Because of the intermittent nature of the fighting, they didn't go up again, and maybe like you fall on a bike, you get back on it. They sat there and stewed about it because the next mission might be scrubbed. The next mission might not. The next day they might not fly because of conditions over the target, conditions over the field. You could wait a week. When am I going to die? Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. When did Harry get it? He got it on a Friday. God, are we flying on Friday? You're thinking about it all the time. That's when the guys broke down, and that's how they broke down.
Yeah, I think both the book and the film, the series, did a great job of portraying the trauma that these people experienced. And then the chalet they sent them to, what was called Flak House.
Flak House.
And then I thought Rosenthal's interesting there, in that he decides he wants to go back, right? So talk about how did they keep them flying? What did they do? Flak House was one of their escapes, but how did they address this? This was an unprecedented challenge for the Air Force.
Well, the Flak House didn't work. Sodium pentothal and sodium amytal were two drugs they gave them. They'd shoot you up with these drugs at hospitals all over England, and they put you into a semi-coma for 2 or 3 days. And then they try to, in the Freudian fashion, pull the trauma out of you by having you relive it, by screaming at you and trying to relive verbally the combat that brought you down. Well, that just made guys scare and made guys worse. The two doctors would get over him while he was on the floor and say, Harry just got hit. He got his arm blown off. Dick got it in the shoulder. There goes it. And that was the treatment. So there was the only thing that worked is when they told the guys they didn't have to fly anymore. But they did get in the plane. They didn't have to get in the planes. It's an all-out volunteer outfit for one thing. Two, suppose a guy doesn't get in the plane and said, I can't fly. He doesn't go in the brig. He's not made a prisoner. He isn't ostracized by his fellow airmen. They sympathize with him. They try to cover for him. Go on the mission. We'll protect you. We'll take care of your responsibilities. What would happen to you is you get reduced in rank and transfer to another base. So you might be a pariah to some people, but not to your comrades. So they made a decision to get in that plane. And I think you answered the question. It was because the guy in front of you went, your buddy went, that you went. It would have been harder not to go. Shelby Foote has a scene in Ken Burns' The Civil War with Pickett's Charge, where he says to Burns, he said, it would have been harder not to go than to stay with R.E. Lee there and Pickett there.
I know you guys have lots of questions, so we're going to get to that one second. I wanted to talk about the prison camps, but I think we'll jump ahead because I think the most moving scene for me was when they do the food run in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
So talk about it. I mean, I think it's great in the book, it's great in the film, but that.
Well, they found out.
It meant to them.
They found out at the end that the Dutch were in a jam at the end of the war. The Germans are ready to hang it up. And they had a neo-Nazi who modeled himself on Hitler, who was running Nazi operations in Holland, and he refused to surrender. And the Dutch were dying of starvation. He had cut the country in half. The British and Canadian sector were given some food. They cut off all food up there. And so they're dying by the tens of thousands. And Eisenhower said, we're going in. We're going to fly in food. And the fear was that they would fire on them. And he said, well, if you fire on them, you're going to pay. There's going to be trials after the war. And there's going to be a finish to this war. It's going to be in a few days and you're going to pay. And a lot of the guys are coming back. Our guys are coming back from prison camps. And here's a chance after all the killing. And don't forget, a lot of these guys had children of their own. And knew that babies and young children were dying. And this was a chance it's an all volunteer effort. Chowhound, it was called, where they loaded the planes up with food, put it on the parachutes, you saw them, and all that stuff really happened. The Dutch actually cut the tulips fields to say thank you, Yanks, and things like that. And it was a tremendous closure for a lot of the guys that they were helping people. And also what we didn't portray is they also flew missions to the continent to pick up POWs. And so they flew them back. And Rosie said he flew a group back and he thought, I'm going to really give them a thrill. I'm going to fly around the Eiffel Tower. And he did a big loop. And he said, 60 guys in the plane packed in there all threw up. They got him back.
Yeah, the scenes of the returning POWs, especially after those death marches that were just so brutal, when the Sherman tank finally comes up the road to liberate them, that must have been an incredible moment. Now, were you able to interview any of the pilots who had been at that camp when it was liberated?
Yes, yeah, and quite a few actually. Some of them are characters, minor characters in the earlier parts of the book. There's so many characters, sometimes it's hard to discern the difference between them. Frank Murphy, for example, saxophonist, college student from Atlanta, Georgia. He's a key guy. He formed a band and orchestra in the Stalag and everything. He's in the camp. And he wrote an excellent memoir of his experiences and describes describes Patton coming in that day. So there are a number of accounts. And Egan later wrote an account himself of this. And a lot of them went back and told their accounts to there was a kind of an autobiographer at the 100th Bomb Group. His name was Red Bowman. And he would regularly meet with the guys and take down their oral histories. And what a find that was when I found that in the archive there. And it's a day-by-day calendar and diary of the experiences of the 100th Bomb Group based on interviews with these guys. It was a terrific source.
That kind of primary source material is gold.
Will be, yeah.
Okay, we're going to take questions now from people. Raise your hand. Rebecca will bring a microphone around, and because of the people on the Zoom call, they won't hear the question unless you use the microphone. So who's going to be first?
All right. Actually, we have it. We're going to start with the question from Zoom, which was, what was one of the most unique aspects of the air bomb cruise that you discovered through your research during this period of the war?
Of the air bomb what?
Air bomb cruise that you discovered. Yeah. So what was the most unique aspects of the air bomb cruise?
I don't know what they mean by cruise. Oh,
crew, plural.
Yeah. They were disparate crews, made of every nationality, although African Americans weren't dealt with. The way we dealt with that question of the African Americans in the film was, we thought, well, we could bring in a character who wanted to volunteer for the Air Force and was denied because he was African American. Well, there's not a lot of drama in that. but African Americans pushed themselves into the war by lobbying with the NAACP, with A. Philip Randolph, who was a major leader of the African American community at the time, of the Black Railroad, Brotherhood of Railroad Engineers. And they got Eleanor Roosevelt. They got her support. She went down to a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, where the Air Force had been forced. The Air Force was forced in World War II to recruit. All the services had to recruit at least 12% of their force had to be. That's equivalent to the 12% of the African Americans in the American population. So that's what you had to have. But you didn't have to send them. There was no stipulation you had to send them into combat. What the Marines did is they ignored it for a year. And then in the Pacific, they put these guys in rear units where they don't see much action. But through their own intrepid actions, these guys pressed themselves forward, and they were on bases where the segregation was terrific. There were German prisoners on the bases. They were allowed in to see the movies in the front rows. The Americans sat in the back. They sat in the back on the railroad cars when the guys moved from one base to another, and the German prisoners sat up front in the first class cabins. I mean, some young American airmen told me that African American women, fiancés and wives of Tuskegee Airmen, were shot in the streets of places like Montgomery if they were seen shopping and things like that. So they suffered horribly. So we thought, this is a great group. They weren't attached to the 8th Air Force, but they were attached to the 15th Air Force, which was an air force formed in Southern Europe for the second invasion at the end of the summer of 44. But they did fly to Hungary and Austria and Germany, and they did escort 8th Air Force formations. And they did shoot down a number, including 3 jets, a number of enemy aircraft. And they were actually in that Stalag. And I had interviewed years ago 2 of them at the World War II Museum. And I didn't put a lot of it in my book. I did write a chapter on them in the story of World War II. And I thought I'll save the rest of that for a book I was going to do on the 15th Air Force, which is what's going to be my next book. But I didn't do that. So we thought it's pretty legitimate to put it in there. We didn't put it in for political correctness or any of that kind of stuff. We got a lot of that bullshit from people on the internet, which was crazy. Yeah.
The Red Tails certainly deserved the recognition they got. All right. We have a question. Raise your hand. Okay, we have one up over here in the front.
And watching the Apple TV movie, the narrator in the movie was a navigator.
Harry Crosby.
Right. Who became airsick when he first went up in the planes. And then they eventually promoted him, and he actually did the planning of the bombing missions.
Yes.
Can we talk about the significance of that individual in the movie and the role that he played during this time?
Yes. Well, first of all,
planning those missions.
Harry was a wonderful writer. He went to Iowa Writers School, and he was plucked out of it. It's one of the best writing schools in the country. He was working on a novel at the time, and he wound up his career teaching writing at Harvard. And his students, I interviewed a number of them, are very loyal to him. And he was a wonderful teacher. And he was a volunteer, and didn't volunteer to be a navigator, wanted to be a pilot, flunked out of flight school, and usually went down and became a radio man or like him, a navigator. And he wrote, one of his significances is he wrote a wonderful book about his experiences with the 8th Air Force, Wing and a Prayer. It's really a very personal account, and it's excellent. So that was one of his major contributions. In the film, it shows you how untrained guys, I mean, Harry told me, he said, I couldn't even do long division, and I'm a navigator. You know, I was a history major and a writer. And all of a sudden, I'm in the middle of the Atlantic. Where the hell are we going? We just landed on an ice field. And he said, I thought we were going to die right there in Newfoundland. And I got to get us to, I don't know where in Ireland, but somewhere. Of course, he flew to England and tried to fly to England and wound up in France. And so, and then like, it shows you in a sense, he was there as a template to show you how untrained these guys were, how America was rushed into that. Remember in 1940, the draft bill. We had a draft the year before, but it came up for renewal and it passed by one vote. Or we wouldn't have had an army after Pearl Harbor. And one vote. And well, you know all about that. Your archive, the FDR archive, is loaded with that sort of stuff. Did a lot of work up there. And but anyway, then I said, we kind of need one. How do you move the narrative along? Well, we talked about how you do it as a writer. Well, one way you can do it as a filmmaker, you can't have Alistair sitting in a lounge chair, telling you about the classics, and but you can't have Deus Ex Machina, somebody speaking through the clouds. We tried that a little bit with the Pacific. It was kind of hokey. Get in trouble for that. Glad this isn't filmed. And but I said, why don't we do him as Nick Carraway? Remember Nick from Gatsby? He's Gatsby's friend. He's in the story. He moves the story along. He knows Daisy. He knows all the characters. Okay. Yet he is part of the show, but he's narrating what's happening and his feelings about it, his interpretation of Gatsby's crazy infatuation with Daisy. I said, he said, that might work. But I'll tell you a quick funny story. Kurt Sadusky, the associate producer, and I sat down and said, we were in Hollywood, we're going to knock out one page of script to try it out. And we're going to do it right after lunch. So we started at 1 and we quit at 5. And we had exactly no sentences at 5 o'clock. That's how badly that started. It was hard to do. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think that his voice, both as a character, as you see his struggles and the pressure he feels under, and how he evolves to become this leader and a commander, and the weight he feels when they send him on these missions and only half the planes come back. Very, very, very powerful. Do we have another question over here?
Actually, we have a question from Zoom real quick. So I hope none of these are spoilers for those of you who haven't seen it. Cover your ears. The woman the navigator has an affair with disappears from the story. And was that the common experience of spies? To just disappear?
No, we made that one we made up. Yeah, that one we made up. There were lots of, 40,000 British women married American servicemen. So something's going on there. That's just in England. Okay. Just in England. So there were these kinds of things. And when you travel around the countryside, around the air bases, and go to the chapels, we wanted to go to the chapels because we were going to film a wedding of an airman marrying a villager, which happened all the time. But the lobbies of the churches, as you go through the front door, there are pictures there, photographs all over the place, and a lot of them are weddings. One of them occurred the day after D-Day. The church is absolutely packed with guys who had been on the beaches that day. And a young airman who had flown marries a village girl. It must have been very powerful. I couldn't talk them into doing that. I really wanted that particular scene. Yeah.
But there were a lot of women who were involved both in at Bletchley Park in the intelligence, deciphering German codes. But also there's a new book that just came out, I believe, by a woman named Helen Fry called Women in Intelligence that goes into this details of their exploits. They would parachute into France and help the underground. So although the character is not in this book as a real person, she represents a real segment of the war and an important one. Okay, we think we have a question over here.
Yeah, I just want to just like to make a quick observation.
Yeah, just
A quick observation for you. You mentioned earlier the World War II Museum several times. Actually, you've talked about the World War II Museum. New Orleans has always been a wonderful place to go, but it's even more wonderful now with the addition of that museum and the scope of that place. My wife and I were just there a week ago. I didn't believe what was there. I want to thank you. You mentioned you were on the board of directors, and the founders with Stephen Ambrose and others, and the funders. I think it's just absolutely terrific, the place, and I think every American should go there and bring their children there. Absolutely.
It's great. We dedicated our last building, which is a building that deals with the post-war period in memory. Looking back, what did the war mean morally, politically, and all that sort of stuff. And we had 22 veterans there, all but 2 on wheelchairs, and the other 2 were on walkers, and all in uniform and out on the parade ground. And it was absolutely terrific. And my mind went back to the day we opened the museum with the parade with 60,000 people attending the parade in New Orleans. And we had over 3,000 veterans there that day. And that was right after 9/11. And so we're losing them fast. And it's just so precious to have them around. And it really pained me. The delays pained me extraordinarily because I'd get these letters, please finish, we want to see this film. Or these men, even coming not from the veterans themselves, but these men deserve to be honored and get this film out. And now I was telling my wife today, I get at least 3 or 4 mailings a day from veterans who have read or had the book read to them, or mostly from the children and grandchildren who finally absolutely recognize what their fathers and grandfathers and uncles did during the war, never realizing how tough the combat was.
They didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, they didn't want to talk about it. Yeah.
In terms of World War II Museum, I totally agree with you. It's fabulous. It started out, of course, as the D-Day Museum because of the Higgins boats that were built in New Orleans, and it has just expanded and gotten better and better over the years. Okay, we have one over here and then another one over there.
In the Apple series, one mission is depicted where the bomb crew don't have enough fuel to return to base, and they have to fly on to Africa, of all places. That's a story I had never heard. Can you tell us more about that? That seemed pretty spectacular.
Well, that's the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission. They were going to hit 2 cities at the same time, factories in the 2 cities, one an aircraft factory and the other a ball bearing factory, because ball bearings are all machines. And to deflect the German fighters so that they don't swarm on the one returning mission. I'm not going to go into the beginning of the mission. That group is ordered to, and they thought they would have the gas to do this. That group, instead of returning to England, would make a right-hand turn and fly down the spine of the Apennines through Italy and land in North Africa. But they had stayed over the target a little longer than they thought because they weren't getting good reads on the targets, and so they're running a risk, right there and then. And they knew it was going to be really hairy getting down there. So I think we portrayed exactly the way it happened. They lost some of the planes in the mountains on the way down. They lost, I think, 1 or 2 in the Mediterranean, and then the rest landed in North Africa. We had an Air Force in North Africa that was doing bombing of Ploiești, the oil fields in Romania, and also southern France. And they did fly a mission. The idea was it was called a shuttle mission. They loaded them up with bombs again, and when they flew back to England, that was a bombing raid. they hit a couple of French targets on the way back. Yeah.
Okay, do we have somebody over here? Here we go.
Just first, thank you for doing this. I am a grandson of a bombardier, and to your point, never realized the impact. I've read, my father wrote a book about it, and never realized it until seeing the flak come up through.
Mm-hmm.
I woke up on a Saturday morning in tears, like, what have I done? Why didn't I serve? What was I doing at that age? So thank you for portraying it that way. One of the things I've learned is that you alluded to earlier was that most veterans came home and wouldn't talk.
Right.
They just went back to normal life. I think the leadership that they were put in, how did you get them to open up so candidly and discuss this? Because my grandfather never talked about it. It wasn't until he died and passed away that we understood what he had done. So how did you embrace that?
One technique that we tried first, and it was an experiment in that film, He Has Seen War. We invited the veterans' families with the veterans to a really nice hotel in a number of American cities. LA, Philadelphia, we were at the Ritz-Carlton. We put them up for a week at the Ritz-Carlton, and we stayed away, and we just let them mingle with one another, have dinner together, have drinks together, talk together, and really get to know each other, because many of them had been separated by the number of years that separated us from the war. And I think that helped an awful lot. And then everybody was there during the interviews, and we interviewed the men one at a time. And I'll give you one instance, explain 1,000. I was interviewing this Marine, his name was Phillips, and he's a friend of a guy named Eugene Sledge, who wrote one of the great books on World War II. It's The Old Breed, it's called. He's a Marine and served at Peleliu and Okinawa. And I was interviewing Phillips, his best buddy from youth. And I said, did you ever experience combat fatigue? Did you ever really feel you were going to break apart? He said, no, I was trained. I was a Marine. We were tough. We sucked it up. I said, well, what about Eugene? Eugene Sledge. He told me that he did have combat fatigue and suffered from it his entire life. He broke down every day, on the anniversary of Okinawa, the battle of the landings in Okinawa, and was a tough guy to live with. He couldn't sit and watch a movie like Patton. His son said he ran out of the room and started pounding the refrigerator. And he's a guy that doesn't talk about the war. I talked to his students at the small university he taught at. None of them knew he was even in World War II. But so he's talking about Sledge, and I said, well, let's get your company commander in here, who was at the hotel. And so I brought in the company commander, and he goes, Sid, you broke down. Don't give these guys bullshit. Tell the truth. And he said, Don, let me alone with him for a minute. And they sat and they talked, and it wasn't aggressive. And I went back in the room, and he just opened up. But he did it for his comrades, yeah. And that's, getting to know them was absolutely crucial. And involving the families was absolutely crucial. Because you forget, they're on a set, they're on an interview, and they're going to go home, and they're going to talk to their loved ones about it. And what are they, what'd you say? What'd you say? So talking to them was very, very important. So there's a lot of ways to do it, Steve Ambrose was a little more aggressive. He'd go into a reunion group that was in that had rented a room, to have a little cocktail party. He'd run in the room and he'd jump up on the desk and introduce himself and just start talking about how he's going to do a book on World War II and he wants to interview him. It worked for Steve. Never worked for me like that.
We're going to have one last question. They're back here, the lady with the blue sweater.
Very much. I read a lot of books about New York City because I'm interested in it. And if anybody else in the room is interested in New York City, you have to get Supreme City that Don Miller wrote.
Terrific book.
It's the best book I've ever read about New York. I wanted to ask you about how there was a line in Citizen Soldiers by Stephen Ambrose about the fact that men who came back from World War II were not isolationists. They believed in the UN, they believed in NATO, they believed in doing anything it took to maintain the peace because they didn't want their sons and grandsons to go through what they did. What can we do I feel like as I watch Masters of the Air, I'm always feeling like we're not honoring these guys in this to the extent that we have become, a segment of our country has become so isolationist. What do you attribute that, and what do we do about it?
I don't know.
Easy question. Easy question. The great way to end it.
Well, what made it easier in World War II was having a common enemy and an easily recognizable enemy that is doing in public, atrocious acts that can be undeniably attributed to them and taking credit for them, and acts that are a direct threat to the American national interest and to the lives and well-being of American civilians. If you have that going for you, it is a little bit easier. But you hit on something that's really important. My grandson is stationed in Africa. He's in Alaska. He's airborne, and they go through tough training. But I was talking to him on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and he said, the one thing we never get, and I spoke about this at the Air Force Academy 2 weeks ago, and the guys were telling me the same thing. We're not getting enough history. Hardly any of the cadets knew anything about the 8th Air Force. And that's why their instructor invited me out there. And, I spoke to 2,000 of them over the course of a week, and the interest was immense. Why do you fight a war? How do you fight a war? Are there rules for war? How do you defeat enemies that won't surrender? These are questions that they should be dealing with in the classroom, and they often weren't. And I was called in by the chief of the Air Force 8 years ago to D.C. They were running a graduate class for young airmen in their early 30s who were ready to be promoted from major to colonel. These are the future generals, the generals of the future. And what he was telling me beforehand is give them some history. He said, if you have a Marine in here, they know their history. They know Okinawa. They know Iwo Jima. They can tell you all about it. None of these guys know Regensburg, Schweinfurt. None of them know anything about the air war. So we need a little of that to have some esprit and pride in what we're doing and how we fight and what we fight for. And there are causes worth fighting for. And, so I think a little more knowledge, maybe a little less on the technical side, and a little more of a liberal arts education would help a lot. I did a book on a fellow named Lewis Mumford a long time ago, and during the war, Mumford was too old to serve, but his son did serve and was killed in Italy. And he said that he taught college courses to officer training candidates, and they were rushing them through officer training course, and they had to do this quick 1, 2, 3 course on history. But he said the guys who knew they were going to go into combat, they wanted to talk about values, and they wanted to talk about morality. They wanted to talk about some of the great thinkers on these issues, because they were going to be experiencing the things that an Athenian or a Spartan soldier experienced. And he said the thirst for knowledge was unbelievable during the war, when the guys knew when it really mattered.
Well, Donna's got to sign books in a moment, but can we first have a thunderous round of applause?